We are going to start the session now. So over to the moderator, Mr. Aruf Malik.
Good afternoon to all industry colleagues and members of our council. I am Arup, and on behalf of the entire TERI team, I welcome you all to today's webinar on the business case for energy transition in Indian industry. Quick introduction to the TERI CBS. As many of you would be aware, our council is a group of Indian business leaders working on a shared commitment to mainstream sustainability in business strategies and practices. We at TERI have set up this council to recognize and promote sustainability leadership practices. The TERI Council for Business Sustainability serves as the interface for our research work to be connected to the corporate world. We are delighted to host a series of thought leadership webinars that discusses and deliberates emerging trends on sustainability which Indian companies and businesses should be cognizant about. The webinar shall last for 60 minutes. The webinar is an interactive session, and all of you could have an opportunity to pose questions and queries to the speakers during the course of the webinar. You can type your questions in the dialog box available on the right-hand side bottom corner of your screen. The speakers will answer your questions by turn. In case you are unable to hear us or view the display, please contact my colleagues. The mobile number is available on the screen. About today's webinar. The Energy Transition Commission brings together a diverse group of leaders from across the energy landscape: energy producers, energy users, equipment suppliers, investors, not-for-profit organizations, and academics from the developed as well as the developing world. The aim of this commission is to accelerate change towards low-carbon energy systems that enable robust economic development and limit the rise in global temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Energy Transitions Commission ETC India aims to foster adoption of low-carbon pathways in India through intense and informed discussions between various stakeholders. ETC in India is led by TERI as the secretariat. In its first year of inception, ETC in India focused on policy, research, and discourse on decarbonizing the electricity sector. While that work is still continuing, in the second year, ETC India will start to focus on decarbonizing industrial sectors, with a particular focus on hard-to-abate sectors such as iron and steel, cement, and petrochemicals. The energy transition can be characterized according to 3 pillars of action: energy efficiency improvement, promotion of renewable energy and its integration into the national electricity grid, and transition in end-use sectors to low-carbon energy sources. Within the hard-to-abate sectors, a particular challenge arises from the lower level of technological readiness, higher incremental costs of zero-carbon technologies, and concerns about consumer costs and international competitiveness of energy-intensive sectors. The key questions that the speakers will address during the webinar are: number 1, do the technologies already exist that are required to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors? Number 2, what are the roles of cross-cutting technologies like hydrogen in enabling energy transitions in the Indian industry? And number 3, will this industry transition impact the costs for the producers of products? And will this be different for different sectors? Colleagues, we have today with us the co-chairs of Energy Transition Commission as our speakers, Lord Adair Turner and Dr. Ajay Mathur. We'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Ajay Mathur. Dr. Ajay Mathur is the Director General of TERI, and is a member of the Indian Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change. He was a leading climate change negotiator and was the Indian spokesperson at the Paris climate negotiations. He served as the interim director of the Green Climate Fund during its foundational period. At TERI, he is spearheading the move to accelerate action towards a low carbon and cleaner economy through the adoption of renewable energy in the Indian electricity sector, enhancing efficiency in buildings and industry, and promoting environmental quality through recycling of material waste and biotechnology-based solutions. He co-chairs the Global Energy Transition Commission and is also the co-chair of one of the climate initiatives of the One Planet Summit. Dr. Mathur will share the perspectives on the relevance and opportunities that this transition holds for the Indian industry. Over to Dr. Ajay Mathur.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Arup, it's a pleasure to be here. As Arup mentioned, as we look to the future, the Energy Transitions Commission, for reasons of technological maturity and therefore the level of readiness of adoption of technologies as well as of policies for their adoption, looks at the change in a number of buckets. The first bucket obviously is energy efficiency. There are lots of technologies available. We need to see how we enhance their adoption. It is interesting to note that the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit, which is scheduled for the 23rd of September, has a number of energy efficiency initiatives in it. There is a cooling initiative, which is really around making air conditioning more efficient, very important for us. There is also a 3% club, which is a group of countries which push for energy efficiency achievements of more than 3% a year. These are things that the Prime Minister has pushed and will commit to at the Climate Summit. So that's the first. The second, as Arup mentioned, is the decarbonization of the electricity sector. The Energy Transitions Commission globally has seen that this is an opportunity because prices are declining. In India, we see already that the prices of solar energy are less than that of coal electricity, but only when the sun is shining. Therefore, as battery prices decrease, there is a good possibility that the price of electricity from solar plus the storage at any time of the day may be less than the price of electricity from coal. But in order to do so, it is important that the grid should be able to operate flexibly. So that's the second bucket. The third bucket is if we are decarbonizing electricity, can we move fossil fuels in sectors, say transport, to use electricity instead? And hence the emphasis on electric vehicles and the emphasis on technologies, business models, and policies that enable us to reduce our fossil fuel dependence. This is an area where some technologies are mature, other technologies are evolving, but it's a business and policy landscape that is still needs to be defined, not only in India, but in most countries of the world. The fourth, and this is the heart of today's discussion, is the industrial sector. Now, in the industrial sector, there is obviously energy efficiency inputs that you can put. They will lead to lower and lower carbon, but not to zero carbon. There is obviously electrification of places where we use fuels. That's great. And especially as the electricity sector decarbonizes, to that extent, the industry would also move towards zero carbon use instead of fossil. But the greatest challenge is in sectors such as iron and steel, cement, petrochemicals, aluminum, fertilizer, bricks, etc. These are sectors where today we actually do not have very clear and technological and economically efficient solutions that are zero carbon. All of these are sectors where growth is occurring and will occur rapidly in India. For example, in the steel sector, it is expected that between 2020 and 2050, the demand would quadruple. Now, somebody who sets up a steel plant today uses technologies that are available today, and if you're making steel from scratch, one would probably use a blast furnace route. Challenge, unfortunately, is that blast furnace is based on coke, results in carbon dioxide emissions, and 20 years from now, as the world faces an increasing climate change problem, we may have restrictions on carbon dioxide emissions from industry, which may mean that these blast furnaces may need to be closed down before their economic life is over. In other words, we end up with stranded assets. This is a huge challenge. In all of the sectors that we just spoke about, there is an issue of what are the kinds of interventions that we take now that are safe, that are viable, and that move us towards a zero carbon future. Now, if decarbonization has to occur, clearly the solutions need to be scalable and cost effective. Now, at the moment, we have the challenge that while in some of the sectors there are some interventions that have occurred, but they are very small, the technologies are not mature or exhibited at scale, or that they are very expensive. So, for example, at a small scale in a plant in Sweden, there is an ongoing project to look at zero carbon steel. But, in a sense, watch this space. Similarly, if we look at cement, it's quite possible that all the heating that is needed could be converted into electric heating, the electricity coming from fuels. But the calcination reaction would produce CO2. So we really don't know a way of making cement without CO2 production. Yes, what we can do is use the CO2 and capture it and use it. So carbon capture and utilization, or carbon capture, utilization, and or storage could be ways ahead. It's also quite possible that we may move to newer chemistries. This is particularly true in the petrochemicals sector. In the steel sector, let's look at the use patterns. Is it possible to move towards the greater use of timber than steel, particularly for higher-rise buildings, particularly for the kinds of tensile strengths that we look for in steel? We need to find out if that's possible or not. In other words, there are a range of options that could throw up solutions for these sectors, which include hydrogen, for example, direct hydrogen reduction for steel production, electrification where heat is needed, carbon capture utilization, as we said in the cement area, new chemistries, new materials, and obviously one of the key issues is that we enhance recycling. This is important because what it means is that virgin material usage is minimized, and more used materials are employed to create the final product. For example, in steel, we could depend more and more on scrap steel. There obviously is a problem because in countries like India, where demand is growing, the amount of recyclable material that is available would be, in a sense, dependent on what was produced 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago. But nevertheless, in the longer run, recyclability is a very strong way of ensuring that we make the best use of our resources and minimize and ultimately take to zero the use of virgin resources, which would also imply the emissions of carbon dioxide. Let me take one example in slightly greater detail. That is of hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is a solution, as I said, which is quite possible that we may move towards a direct hydrogen-based reduction for steel production. But it could also be used for transport. It could also be used for power generation through fuel cells. It could also be used for high temperature heat in industry. In other words, there are a whole range of options in which hydrogen could provide the kind of energy or chemical usage that is currently provided by fossil fuels. But the important issue is that the hydrogen itself would need to be renewable, in other words, come from the splitting of water based on renewable energy. It's a bit of a challenge in India because water itself is a scarce resource, and if this process is such that all the water, all the hydrogen that is produced, ends up as water, that water is collected and recycled, that's great. That's clearly difficult in applications such as transport, but these are areas where we would need to see how we can build hydrogen. It's an area where a lot of technological development needs to be done, both towards the production of hydrogen as well as towards the use of hydrogen. Now, one of the things that the Energy Transitions Commission globally looked at was the kinds of costs that are associated with moving from the conventional fuels and CO2 production to zero carbon dioxide production. And if you look at this, the costs of abatement, that means the costs of carbon dioxide that are not produced, significantly significantly vary. It could be between $25 and $60 per ton of carbon dioxide for steel, but for shipping, it could be much higher, say between $150 and $300 per ton. The challenge becomes who pays for this and when. These are competitiveness issues. These are issues that also depend on the availability of capital. And if capital costs tend to be high, these would not occur. There is also the issue that these are the costs of today. And with scale, they may reduce over a period of time. It is important, therefore, for technology development to both reduce these costs as well as for their deployment as a scale to help drive them down further. However, what is important is that the end cost to the user would be relatively low. And some examples provided here show that the net impact on what you or I pay for the products that come out of the harder to abate sectors, whether it is steel or plastics, or in the shipping sector, what does it mean when a ton of sugar is moved from one country to the other, or the penalty on a ticket, on an air ticket. All of these, you see, are relatively small. Yes, the premium on the zero carbon flights today is much higher than the others, but the others are relatively small. The problem is that while the cost to you and I are small, they are not small as far as the primary producers are concerned. So to the cement producer, this is much more expensive. To the steel producer, it increases the amount of steel. So there is an imbalance in who bears the costs, who bears the economic costs and who bears the final costs. This is a challenge that we need to make sure that we are able to address in terms of the cost reductions and in terms of the cost of capital as we go ahead. Over the next year, we plan to look at the Indian harder to abate sectors, as I said, cement, steel, petrochemicals, bricks, aluminum, trucking, aviation, in far greater detail. Our work is looking at the kinds of growth that is happening, is looking at the kinds of costs that are there, looking at the kinds of technological options that would make both technological sense, that means from a point of view of raw materials, from the point of view of the specifications of the prepared product that are used, as well as the ability of the market to absorb costs. To look at all of these as we look at options in the years ahead. I'd like to leave you with the thought that in the harder to abate sectors, tomorrow will not be the same as yesterday. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. Colleagues, we have received questions from the chat box that do you have access to the slides that the speakers are using? Yes, the slides would be made available to you after the webinar on the TERI website. Colleagues, if you have still not typed your questions, queries, comments for these speakers, you can type your questions in the dialog box available on the right-hand side bottom corner of your screen. The speakers will address your questions by turn at the end of the presentation. We move to our second speaker today, Lord Adair Turner. Lord Adair Turner chairs the Energy Transition Commission, a global coalition of major power and industrial companies, investors, environmental NGOs, and experts working out achievable pathways to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade by 2040, while stimulating economic development and social progress. Lord Adair also chairs the Institute for New Economic Thinking, is the chairman of Chubb Rome, a non-executive director of Prudential plc, and a trustee at the British Museum. In 2018, he joined the advisory board of Shanghai-based Envision Energy. Lord Adair Turner earlier chaired the UK's Financial Services Authority and played a leading role in the redesign of global banking regulations. Lord Adair became a member of the House of Lords in 2006. In today's webinar, Lord Adair Turner will share the global perspectives and highlight the key opportunities in the hard-to-abate sectors and the work that Energy Transition Commission Global has done. Over to Lord Adair.
Well, thank you very much. And this is a very welcome opportunity to contribute to this webinar. RJ has given an extremely good summary of many of the conclusions that came out of a report which we produced in December last year. That report was called Mission Possible and was about how to decarbonize the harder to abate sectors of the economy in both long distance transport and a heavy industry. So I just want to make a small number of points that adds to what RJ has said. Just before I do that, on the background, you've just heard what the ETC is, this coalition of major companies across the world. It is continuing to grow. We have companies from Europe. We have companies from India. We also have a growing membership now in China and also in the US, and we are also involved in Australia as well. And we are trying to develop a point of view as to how the whole world can get to around net zero emissions by mid-century. Let us say by 2050 in the developed world and 2060 in the developing, which is really what we need to do in order to avoid harmful climate change, as well as, however, to create major business opportunities. So the points I'd like to make are as follows. I'd like to begin with a point about electricity, and then I'm going to end with a point about electricity. The thing which is clear, and RJ has mentioned it, is that we will be able to decarbonize electricity production systems at either a very low or at nil cost to the global economy. And the reason why that is the case is that the cost of renewables has come down far faster than any of us dared dream possible 10 or 15 years ago. We have seen reductions in the cost of wind and solar, and also now of batteries, of the order of 70 or 80%, and those costs are going to come down still further. And that means that in India today, solar, at least to provide kilowatt hours of electricity, is a cheaper route than coal. And indeed, the analysis which the team at TERI did in ETC India and produced in February this year suggests that even once you allow for the costs of backup and support, battery capacity, spare capacity to deal with seasonal balances, a system which is fundamentally heading towards being a zero carbon system and gets to be a zero carbon system by mid-century can be fully competitive with a fossil fuel system. And that is the analysis that we are also finding in China as well, where we are doing a lot of work parallel to the work that we are doing in India. So in a sense, the easier bit, I'm not going to call it the easy bit because nothing is easy here. It all requires a lot of investment. The easier bit of the decarbonization challenge for the world is how to take the carbon out of electricity production. We know how to have a zero carbon electricity system with renewables and nuclear. We can do that by 2050 or 2060. And the costs to the global economy or any national economy are not all that large. And what that reflects, and it's a crucial point that RJ mentioned, is the extraordinary power of scale economy and learning curve effects. Solar energy was initially got going with very large subsidies, above all by bluntly the German electricity consumer and taxpayer, to pay for the initial deployment of solar when it was 5 or 6 times more expensive than fossil fuels. But that helped get the industry going. Then there were scale economies. Then there were learning curve effects, improvements in the yield, improvements in the efficiency of wind turbines, and the costs came tumbling down. And that's something that we need to bear in mind when we think about other technologies, that we know that when you back a technology with initial subsidies or with regulation, you can end up getting reductions in the cost, which really are beyond what anybody initially anticipated. That is what we concentrated on in the first year of our work globally back in 2016, and which we are also continuing to work on, in particular in China and India. But having done it at the global level and said we know how to decarbonize electricity, we then asked the question, what do you do about the sectors where it's not so obvious that if you simply had electricity, you have a zero carbon economy? And we called these sectors the hard-to-abate sectors. They are the long-distance and heavy-duty transport sectors like trucking, aviation, and shipping. And they are the heavy industry sectors like steel, cement, aluminium, chemicals. And we did this major piece of work at a global level in 2017 and 2018 to produce the report called Mission Possible at the end of last year to look at these harder sectors of the economy. And the good news here, and RJ has said it already, is that technologically, we know how to decarbonize these sectors of the economy. We don't have to rely on the assumption that we will develop in the scientific labs new technologies that we don't even know what they are now. With technologies which exist at the moment, for instance, using hydrogen to reduce iron ore to steel, using carbon capture and storage, using biomass, across these different sectors, we have answers to how to decarbonize them. We also have estimates of the cost. And RJ has pointed out one of the really interesting and crucial distinctions here on the cost is that when you work out what the cost might be at the level of an industrial product, it might be significant. If we produce steel in a zero carbon fashion, it might cost 20% more than steel produced in a non-zero carbon fashion. And that may be true whether or not we use hydrogen direct reduction or we use carbon capture and storage. If we make cement in a zero carbon fashion and apply carbon capture and storage to the back end of cement kilns, almost by definition, that is going to add cost to the process. So at the level of how much would it cost to produce an aviation biofuel or an ammonia fuel to run ships on, or to do add CCU or CCS to an industrial process? Those are significant costs. But as RJ has said, when we ran them through to what does it mean for the end consumer, how much extra are they going to have to pay for a bottle of Coca-Cola bottled in plastic, which is zero carbon, or how much are you going to have to pay for a car made out of zero carbon steel? It becomes clear that the cost to the consumer and the cost to all economic growth is very low. And I simply wanted to reinforce that point, which RJ has made already, because it then creates an important policy issue, which is how do we get round this conundrum that the costs can be significant at the level of an individual producer of the wholesale product, but trivial once you get through to the impact on consumer living standards. And that does mean that you have to think about the international competitiveness problem. And one of the things that we're now exploring on that is how does one use the combination of carbon prices applied to the heavy industry, applied, let's say, in Europe or in India, but with tariffs at the border to protect that industry against any country which is not applying equivalently high carbon prices. So we are going to have to use policies in order to overcome the fact that there are additional costs for producers, and we need to protect them against the international competitiveness elements of that. But we should do that confident that if we drive towards a zero carbon economy, achieving scale in these new zero carbon technologies, we will almost certainly find that the costs will come down in a way which really surprises us, in a way that they did with the costs of wind and solar and batteries. The final comment I want to make, and it is to come back to the shape of the overall economy, which will emerge if we have a move towards a zero carbon economy. There are essentially 4 technologies to drive a zero carbon economy at a sort of overall level. One of them is then dependent on one or other of the two, of the other 3. The 3 core ones are electricity, carbon capture and storage, or the use of biomass as an energy source. The 4th one is hydrogen. And the reason why I put that in a slightly different category is that hydrogen itself is made zero carbon, either by making hydrogen from electrolysis with zero carbon electricity, so it depends on zero carbon electricity, or by continuing to make hydrogen out of steam methane reforming, but applying carbon capture and storage to it, in which case it's dependent on carbon capture and storage. So ultimately, everything comes back to electricity, biomass, or carbon capture and storage, but with a crucial role for hydrogen, which is made zero carbon, either with zero carbon electricity or with carbon capture and storage. Now, all of these technologies are important, but the more we look at it, and this is true globally, it's true in India, and it is true in China as we're beginning to look at it, the really crucial ones are electricity and hydrogen. We believe that for the world to get to zero carbon economy by mid-century, we have to envisage a world in which the total production of electricity, which globally is now about 22,000 terawatt hours, could increase to something like 90,000 terawatt hours by sometime soon after mid-century. So that is a massive move towards electrification. And we would see ending up with a world in which electricity directly used in transport, in residential heating, in electric cars, and in various industrial processes, which today accounts for just over 20% of final energy demand, could be 60% of final energy demand by mid-century. We also see a massive increase in hydrogen as being likely. At the moment across the world, there is about 60 million tons of hydrogen produced per annum. We could easily see that growing to 600 million tons when you look at all the different ways that you can use hydrogen, whether it in long-distance trucking, whether it is converted into ammonia to drive ships, whether it is used as the reduction agent is steel, whether it is combined with CO2 in various petrochemical processes. So overall, we start with the belief that it is possible to drive the electricity system towards zero carbon at a really very small cost to the global economy and consumers. We have addressed these harder to abate sectors. We believe for every single one of them, including the heavy industry sectors, there is a known technological route to a zero carbon economy. We recognize that there are competitiveness problems to which we need policy answers, which enable companies themselves to commit to zero carbon without being worried that they will be undercut by other companies who are not also making those commitments. And when you add it all together, although there is a big role for bioenergy and biomass and a big role for carbon capture and storage, the really big part of the story is electrification and hydrogen. And I think across all the sectors of the economy, that is going to create huge economic opportunities, which should be attractive for many businesses. So those were my comments, adding to RJ's very good summary of the specific work which we are now doing on India and how the challenges look by some of the particular heavy industrial sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Turner. Thank you, Lord Turner and Dr. Mathur. I'm sure this has been insightful for all participants. We clearly see from both the presentations that within the hard-to-abate sectors, there are several challenges that are coming at front. Technological readiness, the high incremental costs of zero carbon technologies, concerns about consumer costs, international competitiveness, and the associated policies. We shall take up questions received from the participants now, which Dr. Ajay Mathur and Lord Turner shall address. In case, colleagues, in case you have still not sent us your questions and comments, send it through the chat box on the right-hand side, bottom corner of your screen. The first question is pertaining to Dr. Ajay Mathur's point on technological solutions towards decarbonization. Dr. Mathur, a question has come in asking for details on your perspectives on how do we develop a roadmap for commercialization of the technologies for decarbonizing the hard-to-abate sectors. Dr. Mathur.
We are at a very early stage of roadmap creation. In a sense, the fact that we need roadmaps is what has been identified. Last month, the International Energy Agency put out what I would say is a proto roadmap, an early roadmap for the hydrogen sector, which focuses on the various uses for hydrogen and therefore the kinds of things that need to be done on the hydrogen production side, as well as on the usage side and on the infrastructure investments that would be needed for its distribution. We are also at a stage where the learnings about technologies in the steel sector are still evolving. So the short answer is we do not have roadmaps as yet, but we will see them developing over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur.
Could I add something to that? I mean, I think we don't have roadmaps everywhere. On the other hand, there are some companies, individual companies, which are developing clear roadmaps for their individual activity. For instance, if you take the company SSAB, which is a steel company in Sweden. I mean, it's nothing like as big as the really big steel companies like Tata or ArcelorMittal, but it's still a producer of about 6 million tons of steel per annum. They have set out a very clear roadmap to be a zero carbon producer of steel by the early 2040s. And they have set out when they will have a pilot plant up and running, producing steel from hydrogen direct reduction, how they will build the hydrogen storage facilities, etc. So a lot of individual companies are beginning to set them out. And this is actually one of the things that we are doing at a global level. We are inputting to the United Nations process that RJ talked about earlier, of working out what has to happen early in order to unleash the possibility of subsequent further development. How early do you have to have pilot plants in place? And how early do you have to have cheap electricity in place to drive, for instance, the hydrogen production? There are also important issues about roadmaps. If we're going to rely on carbon capture and storage, one has to think about how soon do one need to develop those capacities in order to make it possible to be using them on a large scale in 1 or 2 or 3 decades' time. So those issues of the roadmaps is one of the things that we're now trying to work on at global level.
Thank you, Lord Turner. A question has come in rooted both to Lord Turner and Dr. Mathur, and this pertains to the science-based targets that companies are committing to. The query is, how can businesses which are committed to science-based targets start the process of scenario analysis? And question 2. What are the recommendations that you would provide to such to companies to perform such scenario analysis? If I may ask Lord Turner to come in first, followed by Dr. Mathur. Lord Turner.
Yes, I think one of the crucial things on science-based targets is how to pin down the scenarios to be specific enough. And the reason why I say that is as follows. The climate scientists are telling us points of view as to when do we need to get to net zero emissions across the world to limit global warming to either the 2 degrees in the Paris Climate Agreement or the 1.5, which the IPCC has now said it should be our aim. And most of those scenarios suggest achieving net zero emissions by some time across the world between about 2050 and 2060. And so that gives one a sort of target. The difficulty of translating that to a target for an individual company is twofold. One, what net zero means in terms of gross emissions depends hugely on what you are assuming is the possibility for carbon capture and storage or carbon sinks in the late 21st century. So there is a danger that some companies or sectors might be saying, yes, we agree with the science-based targets, but we think that it will be possible for us to continue to use huge amounts of fossil fuels because we simply plug in the assumption that by 2050 or 2060, the world will be doing huge amounts of offsetting carbon capture and storage. And if you do that, you can use that to justify only a small pace of progress within the company or sector itself. So one has to engage in this debate, and one has to engage very honestly about what is the scenario that you're working on. And there's a debate going on in the world as to whether there should be more defined scenarios for people to react to. What we did in the ETC was argue that, yes, there was a role for carbon capture and storage, but we were thinking of that as a role of not more than about 4 to 5 gigatons. And once you do that, it does imply a very rapid reduction in the use of fossil fuels, in particular coal, but even also oil and eventually gas as well, even by 2050 or 2060. So I think the first step for companies developing scenarios is to engage with this debate about what does a overall net emissions, net zero emissions scenario, what does that mean for gross emissions? And there is a danger that we can have a lot of people claiming they are doing science-based targets, but it doesn't all add up. There is also a danger that you get an individual sector that says, I will get to net zero because I will buy credits or offsets for another sector. One of the crucial points we make at the ETC is when you get to net zero, you really have to that there aren't any offsets to buy from any other sector because they're also at net zero. So we have been focused on how do all of the sectors get to real net zero in themselves, within aviation, within shipping, within steel and within cement by mid-century without telling the story that they'll be able to make a good contribution by buying offsets from elsewhere, because I think that is a bit of a delusion. So that would be some thoughts that I have. But we would be very happy to meet with and talk with any companies that are going down the science-based targets routes about how to think about what the scenario should be.
Thank you, Lord Turner. I'll turn to Dr. Mathur for his reactions and on your perspectives on the specific recommendations for performing such scenario analysis under the ambit of the science-based targets. The associated question also: how relevant is the science-based targets for the Indian context? Dr. Ajay.
I think Lord Turner addressed the issue of scenarios and the necessity of being deeply involved and engaged in the process to make meaningful scenarios. Let me expand on that slightly. If you are a company, the most important issue for you is when do I act and what do I do to act to meet the science-based targets. And my suggestion is that companies need to look at two kinds of technologies. The first is, if I move completely to a zero carbon technology, that's option one. The second is that I go in for carbon capture and storage so that I'm net zero. So these are the two options that you look at. And then you look at the kind of carbon price or carbon regulation which will drive you into one of these two actions. For example, a major automobile manufacturer in India found that a price of $15 per ton of CO2 would move them to electric cars. A major steel manufacturer found that it would be somewhere in the carbon price of $40 to $45 per ton, which would move them to zero carbon steel making technology. This is the starting point. The second, the associated point on this is, you could also turn it into regulatory processes. What is the kind of CO2 emission budget that is allocated to you under some kind of a regulatory framework that would force you to act? And again, this is a cost issue. So these kinds of scenarios help in moving, in deciding when to move and what to move towards. Companies may find, for example, that in some places, carbon capture and utilization of carbon capture and storage may be possible. In other areas, it's geologically not possible. So it helps also to winnow the kinds of options that companies are looking at.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. On your point on carbon regulation, there's a query coming in. Corresponding to India's commitment of 33 to 35% emission reduction by 2030, what do you think would be the likely target for emission reduction by 2050? A related point, would there be sectoral targets in India, for example, the steel sector in absolute terms? Your perspectives, Dr. Mathur.
I'm looking at my crystal ball as I speak. What is very clear is that the shrinking carbon budget implies that we will need to move towards lower carbon. Now, in India, we have the Perform, Achieve and Trade program, which has energy efficiency goals. My own crystal ball gazing is that this will be converted into a program with CO2 type goals. So instead of saying this is the amount of energy per ton of product, it may become so many tons of CO2 per product. If this kind of goal is used, my own feeling is that we would move to a 2050 target where the CO2 emissions are at least 60% tighter than they are today. So you're moving to 1/3 of the carbon emissions in 2050 that you are moving now. If not, again, this is going to be differential. So on some sectors it will be more, on some sectors it will be less. But remember, Lord Turner mentioned that we are looking at net zero by 2060. So it will be difficult to think of a 2050 target that is anything more than 1/3 of the emissions per ton of product that you have today.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. Colleagues, we are running out of time, and we shall take the last question for the webinar today. The last question is directed to Lord Turner. Lord Turner, if you could provide your perspectives on your take on internal carbon pricing, and if you would favor this, what kind of price is recommended for the Indian corporates in the 2030-2050 horizon? Lord Turner.
Yes, that's a very good point. I think clearly a carbon price applied across the world or applied within countries, but with some sort of protection on a tariff basis, would be one of the most powerful levers in the heavy industrial sectors to drive decarbonisation. And just a point, I mean, the carbon price does not need to be incredibly high to drive decarbonisation in some sectors of the economy. And I think RJ showed it earlier that, for instance, steel is not one of the most expensive sectors to decarbonise. Even at current known costs, we could imagine that being decarbonised if there was a price of about $50 to $60 per tonne, whereas the cost to achieve decarbonisation of, say, the aviation sector is almost certainly higher. So one of the most important things that I think companies should be doing is persuading their governments that they should be introducing, as it were, external national carbon prices, which make it possible for the people who want to take action to take that action, knowing that their competitors are also subject to that carbon price. Now, the issue then is, in an environment before there is a external carbon price, what should companies set internal carbon prices? And I think it makes a lot of sense, because if we are serious about achieving a zero carbon economy and avoiding harmful climate change, we will have serious carbon prices at some time. And I think a forward-looking company, while supporting the public policy, will also apply it internally. What some companies do is apply a different price according to whether they're dealing with short-term operational decisions and long-term investment decisions. I was talking recently with the head of Saint-Gobain, the French glass and building materials company. And if I think I have the figures right, they already apply a carbon price of about $25 a ton, euros a ton they do it in, when they are making a short-term operational decision. But when they think about an investment that is going to last, 20 years, they apply a carbon price of more like $50 or $60 a ton, because they think they will be subject to that price over that period. So I think internal carbon prices are very useful disciplines. I think thinking about this distinction between short-term operational decisions and investment decisions, and maybe having two internal carbon prices. And as for what it needs to be, I mean, the world will need to have carbon prices of, let's say, $50 or $60 a ton by 2030, and going up to 100 or 150 by mid-century. So I think that's the sort of figures that people need to be thinking about, and I think will be the figures which by that time will start being applied on an external basis. Hello?
Thank you, Lord Turner.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. On behalf of all our Business Council members, I'd like to thank Lord Adair Turner and Dr. Ajay Mathur. Thank you all participants for such an engaging discussion today. We sincerely regret that we could not take any more questions from the participants that came to us at a later stage. The recording of this webinar and the earlier webinars are available on the TERI CBS website. You can download the recordings and the presentations that the speakers have used. The web link is on your screen. Before we part ways, I'd like to request you to block your calendars for some of our upcoming engagements. Recently, in the month of June in Mumbai, we organized a meeting with the Chief Sustainability Officers of Indian companies. Over 40 sustainability officers joined this meeting. Several contemporary topics were discussed and deliberated. These ranged from the National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct that the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, Government of India has recently launched. Other topics discussed included integration of sustainability in the company's goods and services, internalizing United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, practicing resource efficiency in your supply chain, retrofitting and energy efficiency in existing buildings, and increasing the share of renewables in the energy mix. Our next meeting with the sustainability officers is scheduled in the month of December. Please follow the web link available on your screen to access copy of the presentations and TERI resources on the above topics. You could write to my colleague, Mr. Pankaj Kalyani, requesting for additional details and registering yourself for the next meeting in the month of December. His email ID is on the screen. The United Nations Secretary General is hosting a climate summit on the 23rd of September 2019 in New York, calling on world leaders to come forward with realistic and ambitious climate action in line with reaching net zero emissions by 2050. TERI is working together with the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change as the knowledge partner to the Government of India in preparation for this important work. A set of stakeholder consultations, interministerial meetings, and the CEO roundtable have already been organized. TERI is organizing a side event on industry transition that will take place on the 24th of September in New York. The World Economic Forum is also hosting a number of events on the 21st and 22nd, as well as on the 24th on the harder-to-abate sectors. For more details, please visit the web page available on your screen. You could write to my colleague, Mr. Will Hall, for additional details. His email ID is on the screen. The Energy Transitions Commission, ETC India, an independent multi-stakeholder platform aiming at advancing India's transition towards sustainable, affordable, and secure energy, is hosting a set of stakeholder meetings on the 17th and 18th of October in New Delhi. These would comprise, number one, technical workshop on modeling analysis of the 2030 pathway for the Indian power sector, and number two, a high-level workshop on long-term transitions in the Indian power and industry sectors. You could write to my colleague, Mr. Sachin Kumar, requesting for additional details. His email ID is on the screen. You can access the first knowledge report of this financial year from our council on sustainability super trends. The report bears a message of Mr. R. Mukundan, Managing Director of Tata Chemicals and Co-Chair of the TERI Council for Business Sustainability, along with Mr. Ajay Shankar, former Secretary, Department of Industrial Promotion and Policy, Government of India, and Distinguished Fellow of TERI. A to Z of sustainability is one of our endeavors to provide a repository of words and jargons and phrases comprising a range of environmental, social, governance, and economic topics that are useful and contemporary for sustainability professionals. The first report of the year 2019 bears the message of Mr. Mahinder Singhi, Managing Director and CEO, Dalmia Cement Bharat Limited, and Co-Chair of TERI Council for Business Sustainability, along with Ambassador Ajay Malhotra, Distinguished Fellow of TERI. Please follow the web links available on the screen to access copies of the publication. Several companies in our council's network regularly engage with us. Broadly, there are four categories of such services, namely sustainability strategy and roadmap development, participation in policy advocacy initiatives, performance benchmarking and performance improvements, and training and capacity building. You could write to my colleague, Ms. Pooja Kumar, requesting for additional details and source case studies on how companies have benefited by availing these services. Our email ID is on our screen. Through our partnership with SDG Exchange, we equip organizations with a process that provides guidance and support on how to change from an inside out to an outside in perspective, and how to embrace true business sustainability into your core business operations. SDG Exchange assists companies in creating outside-in business opportunities through positive contributions to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Currently, the methodology is being piloted with Dalmia, Bharat Cement, and Tata Chemicals. You could write to my colleague, Mr. Aditya Singh Raghava, requesting for additional details. His email ID is on the screen. Please watch out for our video series on inspirations from global thought leaders on various facets for building the business case for sustainability. The Future Unfolded series aims to equip you to make the right choices when it comes to sustainability. Our Council for Business Sustainability serves as the interface for our research work to be connected to the corporate world and enables a two-way engagement process. TERI CBS engages with the core issue of what businesses must do to shape and lead in sustainability. For regular updates, annual plan of engagements with our member companies during the current financial year, please visit our website or write to us on the email IDs available on your screen. Thank you for your presence today. We hope you enjoyed the session like ourselves hosting you, and we intend to bring similar engaging sessions to you. I'm signing off and look forward to your participation in our upcoming engagements. Thank you and bye-bye.